Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nicholas and I've been a guide in London for about 10 years now, and today I'll be taking you along the riverside of Mortlake. This is a place where I used to live and spent many happy years in this area. Now it might be one of the lesser known areas of London, but it packs a lot of history, and in this series I'll be walking upriver all the way towards Richmond. And this route here is fantastic for a half-day bike ride or walk, and it's only 20 minutes from London. There are parts of it which feel like not much has changed for the best part of 100 years. Now the recorded history of Mortlake dates back to the Saxon period. There were some ancient wharves here that were used to cross the river and sail up and downstream. They would have been used for the best part of 1,000 years. And there was a fishery here in this area that leased by Edward the Confessor in the 10th century, where we have our first recorded evidence of Mortlake. And this is the man that promised the crown to more than a few suitors. He died shortly after and everyone turned up to claim it. William the Conqueror was the eventual winner and took the crown for himself to become William I of England. And he set about recording exactly how much he had of everything after his conquest in his newly taken lands, and he wrote something called the Domesday Book, or his accountants did, which was essentially a book of accounts compiled by William to find out how much of everything he had in the country. And Mortlake was mentioned twice, with both different variations of its name. Now the name itself is mired in history, but it's probably from the Old English word for salmon, which is mort, and large, which means stream, the salmon streams, and from the fisheries that were mentioned at the time, it fits in quite well. I've also heard it was called the Lake of the Dead, or even Mortis Meadow. But the manor, like many of them, was a huge estate that would have been governed by whoever the king gave it or leased it to in the old feudal system. And whatever the king gave, he could also take away. Now, a manor is a huge area of land. It would have gone miles up and down stream, and it would have the third most valuable land in the county, and owned by the archbishops of Canterbury, who held on to it until the dissolution and the reformation of the monasteries, later by Henry VIII in the 1540s. And the land would have been used for farming and hunting. The place seemed to be where you went to stay. Medieval kings from Henry III to Edward III all stayed in Mortlake on their way to or from London. And it was famous at the time for hunting and its asparagus, which was farmed in Mortlake until the 1920s. Now there's a small lock behind me encased in concrete, but it's a huge amount of history. It's been used since the Saxon times, and would have been one of the main offloading points for the manor, which is just behind here, which was a sprawling complex with its own church from the 1300s. And right behind this wall was once a medieval tithe barn, and that was where taxes were paid. You would go to leave 10% of your asparagus and your fish in this barn for collection by the church, the landowner, and eventually the king. It was sadly demolished in 1865, and there's now a brewery on this site, and on the ground here are still rails that were used for loading and unloading the hops that came in from the river. The river itself would have been a motorway, like a rush hour on a highway at the busiest time of day. There would have been boats coming up and down before the combustion vehicle arrived, and there would have been many steps along the way where these boats would have loaded and unloaded goods. So now, a little diversion from the river to go and look at Mortlake Parish Church, which dates all the way back to the Tudor period. It replaced a church that was once here from the 1400s. Well, this is the parish church of St Mary the Virgin in Mortlake. It's an old Tudor church that dates back to 1543, although all that's left of that is a Tudor tower. The church was rebuilt in the late 1800s, but what I love about it is they left this arch here in the graveyard from the interior of the church, giving it a very spooky and magical feel to the graveyard. The graveyard itself holds some very interesting characters. One of the most famous no longer has a gravestone, and we're not sure where he was buried, but his name was a man called John Dee. Now John Dee was one of the most interesting advisors of the Elizabethan court and a close confidant of Queen Elizabeth I of England. He even set her coronation date to align with the astrological signs of the heavens. He was an astrologer, a mathematician, a scientist, and an alchemist, and in the present day he would have been halfway between magic and science. Well, that would have meant nothing to him at the time, but he would have done well in a Harry Potter movie. But he argued that mathematics was the key to human learning and understanding, and wrote most of his books in English rather than Latin. He was credited with coining the phrase the British Empire and argued with Elizabeth for the colonization of North America. And in his time, he was a wayfarer, forgive the pun, in navigation and cartography. He amassed the largest library in England, larger than Oxford's at the time, and possibly even largest in Europe. Scholars came from near and far to study at his house in Mortlake, and his collection of books was sadly ransacked by a mob after he left England to travel in Europe for 6 years, and he eventually died in Mortlake in poverty and was buried in this graveyard. But his legend lives on, and he's one of the most mysterious characters from the Elizabethan period. Shakespeare is rumoured to have based Prospero from The Tempest off Dee, and some of his possessions are now in the British Museum. And his house would have been just over here, over the wall, which actually dates back to the Tudor period. It's an old wall, and later became the site of the Mortlake Tapestry Works, which is our next stop. What's left of that now is a housing block, but let's move on and go and see where that was. So we're standing on the site of where the tapestry works were. Now the tapestry works were founded in 1616 by James I, and they produced some of the finest tapestries in the land for some of the grandest houses and palaces. Those tapestries are still highly prized, and a couple of them can be seen at Windsor. The humidity of the river was perfect for stretching the fabric, and the river could carry the bulky works up and downstream just behind me. About 140 Flemish families emigrated to London to work on these tapestries. But the only problem in serving the wealthiest nobles is getting them to pay on time, and quite an annoying civil war, and the tapestries eventually closed down in the late 1600s. So from here, let's walk along the river a little bit further upstream. Our next stop along the river is next to the Ship Pub. Now the building was constructed in 1780, but there's been a watering hole here since the 16th century called the Hunter's Horn. In the 17th century its name changed to the Blue Anchor, but the brewery and the malting houses stand around the pub will soon be gone, part of a new £1 billion housing development. But there's been a brewery on this site since 1487 that would have served the local manor and the priory. It would have been like a microbrewery. It didn't really have a commercial enterprise until about 300 years later, missing out on the oldest commercial brewery title, and that belongs to one in Faversham in Kent. But the slipway next to the pub is far older. It's seen the footsteps of thousands of years. Neolithic pottery older than Stonehenge has been found here, and the sandy shore would have made a perfect landing and embarking spot, with the land slowly stretching up the hill here. Now, a favourite pastime with the locals is to sit out here on a sunny day and watch people getting their parked cars flooded by the tide of the river, which is quite low today. But the houses along this stretch of the river are some of the oldest in the area. Thames Cottage here dates from 1608. It's this small little light blue building behind me. And in medieval times there's a path called Amescombe Path that ran right up to the upper Richmond roads until it was cut off in the 1980s by the expanding brewery. The house next to it, the brick one, is called Tudor Lodge, although it's quite a newcomer. It was only built in 1750. The house next to that was built in 1730, although a new front was added 100 years later during the Regency period. But right at the end here is a place called Leyden House, which is the oldest surviving building in Mortlake. Some parts of it date back to the 15th century, although the frontage is from the 18th. All the houses here were built on the grounds of the old manor estate. Well, I'm standing just in front of Leyden House. There's the house from the 15th century. But all of these buildings here would have once been part of the manor of Mortlake. Now, the manor of Mortlake, like we mentioned earlier, has been around for a very long time, but it was home for a short period to one of England's most famous statesmen from the Tudor times, Thomas Cromwell. Now, he was the man who helped Henry VIII break from the Catholic Church in Rome and confiscate its lands, and the manor at Mortlake was granted to him from a grateful king. Not bad for the son of a blacksmith born just downriver in Putney there. When the monasteries got dissolved, Thomas got rich, but there was only one problem with being the second most powerful man in the country, and that was being the second most powerful man in the country to Henry VIII. And it wasn't long before the buck stopped at Thomas's doorstep. He didn't really live at Mortlake, but he stayed here frequently until he sold it to Henry VIII for a very low price in 1540. It didn't help, his head rolled shortly after, and Henry VIII gifted Mortlake to Catherine Parr, who really didn't know what to do with it too much. And the manor house is long gone. It was demolished in the 1800s and the brewery consumed the old grounds, but the gates just still remain just behind there. Now, just behind me here is a little stone, just there by the railing, and nondescript, but it's quite a famous place once a year for what is probably England's quintessentially British sporting event, and it's the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. Now, the Oxford-Cambridge boat race is a sort of sporting event with the two oldest universities in the country, Oxford and Cambridge. They race against each other from Putney to Mortlake. The race was first held in 1829 in Henley upon Thames, and it moved to London in about 1836, but this stone marks the end of this race, and you get hundreds of thousands of people lining the banks of the Thames. 15 million people watch it on TV, although TV was really only around for the first 80 of those races. Cambridge have won it 84 times, Oxford have won it 80. There's been a dead heat once, and I think they've sunk the boats at least 6 times during the period of time. Anyway, but behind me here is the Duke's Meadows, once owned by the Duke of Devonshire. It's a miracle it was saved from development. It would have been huge orchards and is now playing fields. They nearly built an iron foundry over there in the 1900s. And just next to it here is Chiswick Bridge, built in 1933, designed by a man called Herbert Baker, who also designed a lot of New Delhi. Well, okay, so from here let's head on down to Kew, a little bit further up. So we're now walking along the riverbank towards Kew. Now, Kew dates all the way back to the 14th century. It's a Cahu, an old French word, or Cahu, as a dock where boats would stop or unload on their way up or downstream. And it's in this area that Julius Caesar is rumoured to have crossed over the River Thames to fight Cassivius, the Celtic tribal leader, in around 54 BC. And Kew's got quite an individual life from the Tudor period. It's now famous for its gardens, which we'll be visiting on the next stop. But just next to the riverbank here was Kew Retail Park, and the retail park once had a Chrysler factory on it that was built in the 1920s. They made the parts in the USA, but they reassembled them in Kew. Dodge trucks here were known as the Dodge Kew for a very long time. The retail park, well, it closed in 1967, and they built the retail park there and a small sewage treatment place in the 1800s. But sewage was a profitable income. It was known as night soil. It was collected in the tanks under houses in London and shipped out to Mortlake and Kew to be used as fertiliser in the market gardens. But most of this riverside is taken up by some very expensive houses along the embankment, but a lot of this land was saved after they found an extremely rare species of mollusk known as the Thames snail. So much of this land is now preserved as a protected nature reserve. So here we are, just on the Kew riverside, and this beautiful stretch of houses behind us are called Strand on the Green. A lot of buildings from 17th and 18th century construction. It was once a vibrant fishing community, and the Thames had been like a motorway in the rush hour of boats of all shapes and sizes sailing up and downstream. And a lot of the houses here have a slightly Dutch appearance on the other side, and that's because merchants from as far away as Holland would have sailed up here. Some would have made Strand on the Green their home. You can just out make these tiny little steps along the side of the river where the goods were loaded and offloaded. But this small island just behind me here is called Oliver's Island, and the nickname is it's after Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentarians in the Civil War, who took refuge here. That's hardly believable, but it is a nice story. But these islands are called eights in England, and they have a functional purpose. This one, for a long period of time, had a toll booth put on it, and it would have charged boats coming up and downstream a fee as they were passing in return for the upkeep of the river, much like highways do today. In 1890, there was a smithy or a blacksmith installed here, and he would have fixed your boat for free. You'd have moored up and he'd have done the work on it, and that continued until 1990, which is not long ago. And now, as you might be able to hear, it's a refuge for Canada geese. So we're now going to divert a small way off the beaten path here to visit the village of Kew, if you'd like to follow me. Well, welcome to Kew, which is a beautiful little village nestled between Richmond and Mortlake, and we're currently standing in Kew Green. Now, Kew Green would be considered a quintessential part of our traditional villages in England. In Europe you have squares and plazas and piazzas, but in English we have the country green. They're usually steeped in history, and Kew is no different. A communal space surrounded by the beating heart of the village with pubs and shops, one where you can relax in the summer, walk the dog, or enjoy a game of cricket. But Kew's history really came alive in the 16th century during the Tudor period. Henry VIII had a palace at Richmond, just upstream from here, and the area became saturated with courtiers and wealthy people of the court. His daughter Mary, later to become queen in her own right, lived in Kew, and history books are saturated with references to Seymours and Boleyns and Dudleys and Moores, names that one would expect of this area of high value, and all the stone's throw from Richmond Palace. Put it bluntly, they were the IT crowd of the 16th century. But anyway, eventually Kew Palace was built just over here and became by a wealthy silk merchant in the 1630s, and became a royal residence 150 years later. And the land we're standing on is still owned by the Crown. It's leased from Queen Elizabeth II or the Crown Estates to Richmond upon Thames to this very day. Now the gates here, just at the end of the green, lead to Kew Palace. It's the smallest of all the royal palaces and was originally built as a mansion for a wealthy silk merchant in 1631. For George II and Queen Caroline, it was the perfect lodging for their daughters. Several generations of Georgian royalty used Kew as a weekend retreat from London, and George III was incarcerated here when he went a bit mad. Ever since that time, the palace wasn't really lived in, but it was eventually merged with Richmond Palace and Kew Gardens, which we'll be covering on the next part of our journey along the river. Behind me here on Kew Green is St Anne's Church. It was built in 1714 on land gifted by Queen Anne, and it's a resting place of Thomas Gainsborough, a leading landscape and portrait painter in the 18th century. And just before we leave Kew Green, I'm going to show you a really old bit of the town just over here as we pass by the cricket pavilion over here. Cricket's a very traditional English sport, not unusual to see the odd game played in the summertime on greens such as these, but the history of cricket is a YouTube video in its own right. So let's go and have one more look over here before we continue up the river. So Kew Village Pond, just behind me here, predates the Norman conquest. This once natural watering hole was originally fed by a natural creek and the tidal Thames that was here until the 19th century, and it was large enough to fit the barge of Henry VIII on his way to Hampton Court from central London. The first mention of the pond is in 996 as a fishery granted by King Ethelred, and it was used as such until the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the 1530s. It was a watering hole for cattle and nearly filled in and turned into a car park in the 1960s, but still during the high tides of the Thames there were sluice gates that refilled the water from the river by volunteers, just like the creek would have done 1,000 years ago. So we will head back to the river to continue our journey on to Richmond. So we're stopping on our way to Richmond by one of the most famous gardens in the world, UNESCO World Heritage Site of Kew Gardens. Now the date of these gardens dates all the way back to the Elizabethan courts, when wealthy courtiers lived in this area and would show off by having exotic plants in their gardens, and eventually became part of a royal palace of Kew. But in 1772 the royal estates of Richmond and Kew were merged by George III, and the two gardens became one, but they still have the plural name of gardens. And ever since then it's been a home for the most exotic flora and fauna in the country. The first kangaroos in Britain lived here in 1792, and right at the end of this beautiful view here is Palm House. Can't quite see it, but it was built in 1844 and was the first built on this scale with wrought iron, and one of the last Victorian glass houses in the world. It was originally heated by coal, so instead of chimneys coming out they had hidden smokestacks elsewhere in the gardens, and it holds the oldest pot plant in the world from 1775, brought back from South Africa by Francis Mason, who'd sailed around the world with Captain Cook on his adventures. He brought back 500 species of plants, and well, tradition continues, and Kew Gardens today holds the largest and most diverse botanical collection in the world. Absolutely fantastic. But the view across here is absolutely fantastic, and over there is Sion House. Now that's home to the current Duke of Northumberland. Well, why not? You see, they acquired it in 1594, and since then it's remained in the same family. The old home was near Trafalgar Square, where central London is today, but the name of the house comes from the abbey, which was founded here by Henry V, one of the wealthiest nunneries in the country. Eventually dissolved, like the others we were talking about earlier, by Henry VIII, and well, you know, it was sold off eventually. But it's got a lot of history. Catherine Howard was in prison there for 3 months before her trial for adultery with Henry VIII, before heading to the tower to lose her head. But the relation to the Queen of England continues. It was where Lady Jane Grey was told she was going to be the Queen of England. was coincidentally Lord of Northumberland, who unsuccessfully tried to install his family on the throne. It didn't end very well for them either. But the building dates to 1547, the interior designed by Robert Adam in the 1760s, the landscape by Capability Brown. So next to the great manor of Sion is Isleworth, and this was a village that can trace its history back further than any other place we have visited. We can find Isleworth mentioned in an Anglo-Saxon charter in 695, and those were the same people that dug trenches along here to get their boats out to fight the Danes. Now the River Crane runs into the Thames here. That's one of the many rivers of London that act as a tributary to this great medieval highway. And the Church of All Saints, the tower, dates from when Columbus was looking at a map and thinking he might just sail off the edge of the world. But the Isleworth stairs just over here are really ancient too. This is where Lady Jane Grey embarked on a boat for the Tower of London to be crowned Queen of England after being told that's what was going to happen in Sion House just around the corner. She got to the Tower of London, was only queen for 9 days before having her head chopped off. Lady Catherine Howard, 11 years earlier, embarked here for the Tower on charges of adultery, and both would meet their end at the sharp end of an axe. And on we go to Richmond. So we continue our walk along the riverside towards Richmond, and our next stop is unfortunately obscured by a lot of foliage over here, and it's the King's Observatory. Now the King's Observatory was built in 1769 on the orders of George III, who was really into astrology. Its intention was to map the heavens and observe the transit of Venus in 1769, thus enabling astronomers to gain an idea of the solar system more accurately. And this is why Captain James Cook was sent on his first voyage to the other side of the world in the same year, and came back with the idea lemons curing scurvy. And the park has 2 obelisks erected on a north-south meridian line, and incredibly accurate clocks were once housed there, which were given time to many governmental buildings in London. As you may know, the meridian line was eventually moved to Greenwich further downstream, but the observatory is still here. It's now a very nice golf course. Anyway, let's continue up on our way to Richmond. So we're just having a quick stop by Richmond Lock and Weir. Now this small crossing is essentially a stop that prevents the river upstream of draining out. In Caesar's day, low tide would have meant a trickle from Brentford upstream. You would have been able to cross over easily, but one bridge changed all that in 1209, London Bridge. It was a mega structure, the medieval period, more than 200 houses, loads of small arches, and it acted like a dam, stopping the river from draining out, very much like a dam of stones you might have made on the stream when you were a child. But in the 1830s, London Bridge was taken down and a new one built, and the river sped up. They dredged it, and before long the river was back to a trickle. So these locks and these weirs were installed to keep it at an adequate level, and it's one of a few on the river, the next one being Teddington, further upstream. So we've now arrived at Richmond upon Thames at the end of our tour today, and it's certainly one of the most picturesque towns in Greater London. It's got almost this Italian style plaza here where you can sit, watch the world go by, eat a picnic, or maybe have a drink from one of the local pubs. There are rowing boats for hire here, and paddle boards and canoes as well if you want to spend a few hours on the river. On our next tour, I'll be covering Richmond, Richmond Park, and heading off down to Twickenham. So I hope you join me for that one. But no matter where you are in the world, I hope you're all staying safe. Have a great summer, everyone, and thanks for watching.